At Bridgeton Landfill, we decided to launch our organization, Earth Defense Coalition, due to basically St. Louis's role in the Manhattan Project. And so legacy Manhattan Project waste has traveled its way from Mollenkrat, who produced it next to the river, all around up to North St. Louis, and eventually found its spot in Westlake Landfill. Everywhere else, every other site in St. Louis is being remediated, except for the landfill. And so there wasn't really much media attention. This is an issue that's been being fought in our community for probably, it's been present for 70 years, and over 40 years it's been at the landfill. And so 50,000 tons of radioactive material sits in an unlined pit, and nonetheless it has a burning subsurface smoldering event, which is an underground fire 600 feet away.
So it sounds to me, is this the rather infamous radioactive fire at a landfill in Bridgeton that you're referring to?
Sure is.
Okay. Well, where is the radioactive material from?
So it comes from Uganda, the Belgian Congo. And so basically it traveled here, it went to a few different locations. It ended up in St. Louis. A few scientists from WashU, people talked to each other, they collaborated and created the first 2 atomic bombs. And since it's such an old issue, World War II has really just like never ended for St. Louis, in the sense that we're still being poisoned and we're still losing community members, and our children are still being born and forced to live in these conditions. And many people are unknowing, and so that's pretty much why we launched we chose the landfill as a place to target for our debut action. And basically, not a lot of people were talking about it. The EPA was giving us bogus science. Only grassroots people, members of the community that are forced to fight this issue because they live there, were talking about it. And so we tried to get some media attention and said, if you're not going to talk about it, we're not going to allow business as usual, because we don't do business with bad neighbors, and you're not going to continue to poison our community and get away with it. And Alex and I also believe very firmly in direct action, and so that's why we use that tactic and chose that location.
Could you explain the tactic that you used? Yeah, what was the tactic that you used?
Yeah, so on March 31st, 2017, over 2.5 years ago now, we blockaded 2 entrances to the landfill, and we basically used barrels filled with cement and tires and rebar, and 9 of us chained ourselves to the barrels, causing a 12-hour shutdown of the transfer station, and then a blockade at the other entrance of the landfill. And so we did that on that day and garnered region-wide media attention. We had all the local news helicopters flying over, filming the action and talking about it, and kind of set the stage to bring this to the next level of attention. And from there, that was actually the start of a direct action campaign. From there, we continued a series of direct actions targeting elected representatives. Actually, 3 days after that action, that was on a Friday, on Monday, we went into Claire McCaskill's office and occupied her office with like 30 people, demanding that she introduce this federal legislation. We targeted St. Louis Earth Day, who had a corporate sponsorship with Republic Services. We did a die-in in front of their booth. And then we went to Lacey Clay's office and locked down inside his office and occupied his office for 4 hours.
No, pretty much the extent of the business day. We got there early in the morning, maybe 10, and stayed, I think, until about 5, or close to 3, or were they closing at 5?
Yeah.
Because it was like late afternoon. Basically, we only left, it was probably one of our most successful actions.
People had been working on this for a long time, and, there's a diversity of tactics, and people had been, kind of playing by the rules and following that, and we saw a need for escalation to basically push them to the next level. So like Amber talked about, every other site in St. Louis was being cleaned up but the Westlake landfill. And a lot of us and community members believe the reason that was because every other site with this radioactive waste was under the Army Corps of Engineers, and Westlake landfill was under the jurisdiction of the EPA, even though it had the same Manhattan weapons waste as all these other sites. So there was a specific demand to our action, which was to get the site transferred to the Army Corps of Engineers. And that was the demand for the rest of the campaign. And like Amber said, it was actually our most successful direct action campaign, because at the end of it, we refused to leave Lacy Clay's office until federal legislation was introduced to transfer the site to the Army Corps of Engineers. And he was in Washington, D.C. while we were occupying his office, and we were on the phone with him. His legislative aides were faxing us in his office House resolutions and bills to transfer the site. And logistically, he couldn't just introduce it that day, but he did commit to making a public promise that day to introduce the legislation. So we waited, and on Twitter, he promised to introduce federal legislation to transfer the site to the Army Corps of Engineers. And by that night, we took our lockboxes and left because he made this public promise.
Like, what do we do?
This like, never happens.
I guess we should leave. Grab our shit.
So wait a second, that's an amazing story. So,
right.
So you're locked down in the federal office and you're in direct communication with Congressman Lacy Clay.
Correct.
And he makes a public promise to introduce the legislation. Did it happen?
So by that night, so we left and he made this public promise on Twitter, and then we left, and by that night, not only Lacy Clay, but Roy Blunt, Claire McCaskill, and Ann Wagner all signed on and agreed in a St. Louis Post-Dispatch article that they would introduce legislation to transfer the site to Army Corps of Engineers. They did introduce legislation to transfer the site to the Army Corps of Engineers, but the legislation did not pass the House of Representatives. And that was the second time federal legislation had been introduced, at which point the community realized we're stuck with the EPA. So while it's not ideal, we need to focus our attention now on the EPA just coming out with a favorable decision.
So there has been motion on this. I think you probably know of St. Louis Moms organization.
Yeah.
People in Bridgeton, they get a lot of media attention for working on it, rightfully so. But they feel like they've had some progress on this recently and some victories. Do you see it the same way?
Absolutely. I mean, everything we do with consultation with the moms. You know, they inspire us to do what we do and why we started using our bodies. You know, the moms have a much different role. You know, they're directly impacted, and they work really hard, you know, and have stuck to it. But anyhow, what I was going to say is what we intended was to get media attention and to do so in a way in which they weren't able to refuse it. And so we got 2 helicopters. So it worked.
So
and
you think it helped take it to the next level?
Definitely. And also, like, we were contacted by a member of the community who was impacted, a victim of Coldwater Creek, and also a contaminated area. And she passed away a few days later, and her family wrote, you know, a statement to Alex and I and everyone involved, and you're just reminded of like how very real like this is. And she was able to watch our action because of, like, you know, the helicopters and the media, and like she watched it.
So you are working in tandem with the people doing more traditional work. Do you feel like your action actually helped push towards what a lot of people feel is some motion towards resolution at the landfill?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also what we did here, and both of us do a lot of direct action campaign and organizing other places, is really a good testament to working within like an ecosystem of activism where you have like this diversity of tactics. So you had people laying the groundwork. I wouldn't know about the Westlake landfill if it wasn't for just Moms Stl. A protest they organized was the first protest I went to about the action, and that's how I found out about it. And just by going to these meetings and getting involved, we realized there was a lack of direct action organizing around the issue. And so we kind of just like got in where we fit in and filled that role. And throughout the whole process, we've worked together, made sure like our demands were the same, and we were working in conjunction with each other. And because of that, not just because of what we did, not just because of what they did, but people like Kay Dry, our ancestors on this issue, like because of the work that everyone has done is why we are getting to the place we are today. So like it's important to us and a lot of people in the community to connect the issue of Westlake landfill and Coldwater Creek and all these other sites. And since Westlake got one of hopefully many to come favorable decisions on the radioactive waste at the landfill, we want to like kind of broaden out our focus and what would be really awesome if we could use this momentum of the charges being dropped and this getting in the press again is to get up signs along Coldwater Creek. The federal agency ATSDR has recommended, they have no enforcement power and they can't put up signs themselves, but they recommended in their 2018 health study that signs should go up along Coldwater Creek. People have been saying this literally more than a decade. And so now that a federal agency has finally admitted it, it's time for some governing agency to step up. Previously, we were pressuring Steve Stanger's administration to do it. We believe the county should step up because the state of Missouri is a lost cause and the federal government obviously doesn't care. So the county can take this. Coldwater Creek is in its jurisdiction. So we were pressuring Steve Stanger's administration. They were passing the buck. They didn't want to do it. They couldn't do it, blah, 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 blah. But now that Sam Page is in, we are pressuring Sam Page's administration. We've reached out to his administration and we expect a response soon. And if we don't get one, we're going to amp up the pressure to get signs finally put up along Coldwater Creek.
Signs saying what?
That the creek is contaminated with radioactive waste. So this creek has been being remediated by the federal government for almost 2 decades now, if not 2 decades.
19 years or something.
Yeah.
Maybe. And I mean, it's essentially, they won't admit it. I mean,
so they won't warn residents and children not to play in the creek.
Correct.
Is that
So,
the issue?
Right, no one knows that there's radioactive waste in it, so how are you going to stop future exposure? 2 weeks ago, I was at a Westlake meeting, and someone had showed up for the first time. 3 people had showed up for the first time, and it was a group of people. Yeah,
this happens all the time.
And I thought these meetings were over, but it was like a group where a group of people showed up. One lady had lived there for 20-something years. She just convinced her family to move there. She has multiple autoimmune disorders, didn't even know about the waste. Her family just moved there and bought into the area around Coldwater Creek, and now is connecting the dots about her sickness and where she grew up and the fact that she just had her family move there. So how are we going to stop future exposure? The government knows it's a problem. They're cleaning it up. They have been for almost 2 decades now, but they're not warning people that it's still contaminated right now.
Correct. And like, we met a woman, I'd like to talk about her because she was just so compelling and like changed my life forever and like reminded me like why I was inspired from this issue to begin with. And her name is Carol Compton. She passed away a few years ago, maybe 2 at this point. Alex we were, so previously when the local EPA, or District 7 EPA would have their little meetings, they would have like an informational booth set up. And so basically you walk around and go interview with people, and it takes away from a collective of a room being able to talk amongst each other. It's able to ask questions in front of the group. And so essentially you're being fed all of this really high-tech jargon and information as individuals, and you're questioning with the person you're standing next to, and you know, maybe you're missing out on that community communication. Either way, so we're there, and Carol sees Alex on the news. And again, a really important factor in media here, because, and like even we've knocked on the door of people, like, hey, like we're trying to get you a buyout, or like, hey, like, did you know this is going on? Like, do you know about this? Like, talk to a lady who is producing CBD in a factory behind the landfill, right? And they've been doing the CBD, like a health medical thing, you know, with claims at least. They border the landfill, and she barely knew about it. She said, well, I've watched a little bit of Atomic Homefront, but it kind of scared me. And so, you know, and I've talked to a lot of employees like that too, that rare cancers and things like that. But back to Lisa, and they don't know, like, you know, multiple rare types of breast cancer in one factory, and like they see us holding signs and come and like, you know, I had this many miscarriages, and this is where I grew up. Like, is this exposure? These are my symptoms. And like, you know, Alex and I are not doctors. We have no idea what the symptoms are, but like, it's really crazy that people don't have any sort of a warning or knowledge about this. And this is almost, you know, over half of a century old, like 3/4 of a century old issue. And I mean, if we're going to create something with this magnitude, we need to have like a little bit of accountability. But
so EPA Region 7, do you think they're interested in people's health or cleaning up an area's image?
I think that they're, well, I mean, Lisa's evidence that they're not at all interested, or, I'm sorry, Carol is evidence that they're not at all interested in people's health. Carol came to the EPA meeting after seeing Alex, and had a cancer that was only ever found in the area surrounding the Belgian Congo. And so why is she getting this cancer living with Coldwater Creek less than 200 yards in her backyard? And that's it. It lived there for 20 years. She was diagnosed, I think, about it maybe a couple years prior. Or she was in remission for a while, and then it came back about a year or two prior to meeting her. And when we met her, she was crying and thankful to Alex and happy to understand, but also, you know, going through the process of understanding that, like, she was environmentally poisoned by something she trusted and something she bought into, and a place she thought she was safe. And not too long later, within a year later, she had her tongue removed, or the part of her cancer removed. So they literally muted her, and they took her voice. And like, we always talked, like, kind of as a metaphor, like, we were very inspired, and like everybody, to be Carol's voice and to maintain her message and continue telling her story, because she left behind a family, children, and you know, they grew up in that house too. And so Maria Chappelle and all really stepped up to the plate with that one and came and took Carol under her wing and just, you know, told her everything and was just like, this is what happened, and I'm so sorry they've done this to you, and like, you know, it's crazy. Like, but then the next person moves into the house and the cycle continues. I mean, we're talking radioactive material. Like, these things don't break down. Like, you know, likely the earth will probably dissipate before like radioactive nucleotides like completely decompose or denature.
Wow, that's a powerful story. Let me ask, so you guys were both at the Convergence in Southern Illinois. And I noticed that there was a pretty large St. Louis contingency there. And I think, Alex, I believe you were working on the media committee, and Amber, I think you were helping out as well. What did you think of the Convergence?
Well, I love the location.
Okay, so you're talking about afterwards. So was there any organizing after the Convergence, or any thoughts about what was going on after the Convergence?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so with people who went to the Convergence from St. Louis, we had a debrief, and we just debriefed the Convergence. A lot of people were in different strategic action sessions, so people talked about the ones they were in, because not everyone was in all of them, and we kind of talked about next steps, and it coalesced perfectly with actually something that Shawnee Forest Defense was a co-sponsor of in St. Louis a few months ago, which was the End of Galenda tour. And so that's when a bunch of people from the Convergence that were organizing it came to the tour, and so we're trying to build that momentum with this, and I felt like out of that came a St. Louis Climate Justice Collective. And then a bunch of people in that collective went to the Convergence, and then after the Convergence we met up, and so we're still in this like meeting phase and seeing what can we do to seed a direct action, a civil disobedience resistance here in terms of climate justice, and connect it to all the other issues locally, and keep that momentum going. I enjoyed just the setting and how it was, and how it really permitted for like discussion and organic discussion, and it wasn't like an in-your-face situation in which you're required to like listen to someone preach to you all day. Like what you got to do is you got to start off at the level that you're at and continue to talk and you know, not waste time.
So do you feel like you built new relationships there, expanded your network?
I think I definitely expanded my network at the Convergence. I also had like recommitted to a bunch of relationships. I saw people I hadn't seen in a long time, and like for me it was more fruitful in that way. People I literally hadn't seen in like 2 or 3 years, and the last time I saw them was on the front lines against the Dakota Access Pipeline, and like just like rekindling that, seeing like what you're working on, where you're at. Like a lot of people in the community, as we all know, are transient and all over the place and working on many different things. So catching up on that, connecting more things was really awesome for me. I kept thinking in my head, like, if industry knew all of the badasses that were in this one area, they would like infiltrate it or bomb it or something, you know, because there was so many amazing people from all over. And one thing I thought was really cool about it, it was a few people from a lot of different things and not a lot of people from one thing. So in that way it was really good, and like having representatives from kind of like all over, and
yeah, from like academia to activism, you know, and who like I'm gonna plug Lisa, because Lisa Martino Taylor, I got to sit down and talk to her and plug her. She is someone who completed a PhD or a dissertation regarding behind the scenes work that the federal government had intentionally been doing on the St. Louis residents of St. Louis with said waste. And so they were intentionally poisoning communities, gathering research and collecting data, and through her due diligence and the digging and putting pieces together and following intuition, she uncovered this shit, and it was so renowned when it came out. I literally was like, I hope she has a bodyguard. Like, this is scary shit. And like, I've wanted Tess so very long. Like, she's like just a remarkable human to me. It's like who's the Love Canal?
Oh, Lois Gibbs.
Lois Gibbs. She's like the Lois Gibbs. She's like Lois Gibbs of St. Louis. The moms are Erin Brockovich. We've got Lois Gibbs and Erin. But I got to sit down and talk to her, and she explained many things. I had so many questions about how things led together. Alex stole the book for me when I was in the middle of it. Her book is called Behind the Fog, and I highly suggest reading it because I have not seen anything quite like it. But anyhow, so that relationship was really cool to nurture, and we've crossed paths a lot, but we've never really gotten to sit down and like chat. And so that was probably the most beneficial and starstruck aspect of the Convergence for me. But you should check it all out.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about?
Really?
No.
Pull mass numbers. Use your body if you can. It is a privilege. Exert your privilege if you have it, and if you don't, that's what the other people are there for. And follow that of the community. If you're fighting a pipeline on indigenous land, talk to the indigenous people. If you're fighting radioactive waste in the backyards of St. Louis residents, talk to those residents. It doesn't have to be your fight. You can plug in where you're needed and sit back where you're needed when you're not. And support in other ways. Like Alex and I do far more than just direct action. We knock on doors, we talk to people. That's the hard stuff. The direct action's easy. Going to jail is easy. Facing the police is easy. Like looking a mom in the eye who's buried a child is not. And we do that every third Thursday, and multiple moms in the eyes that have buried children. So yeah, hopefully we'll see a resolution soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.